All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'll apologize for all those difficult Hebrew words in that introduction there. That was written up a while ago, and it's kind of a mini life story, I guess. It's smicha is how you pronounce that. It means ordination. And actually, it comes from the word to depend upon something or to be rely on something. And because the idea is, um, it's just like when Moses passed on his leadership to Joshua. And you see this also with Elijah and Elisha, and passing on the leadership or prophecy. They put the hands on the head and all that, so that it comes from that tradition. And rabbinical ordination traditionally was one rabbi would then pass it down to a student. So that's where that comes from. So I appreciate the nice introduction that you gave me. And that's, I guess, maybe where I'll start. You mentioned that I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor, and I am. And growing up with the stories from my father of surviving those terrible times, all of us are familiar. Unfortunately, some people, studies showed today that there are many people who are not that aware of the Holocaust and what took place. But millions upon millions of people died throughout the world, but specifically 6 million Jews were targeted by the Nazis for elimination to die either in the death camps or oftentimes just be murdered by German troops. My father survived that terrible event in history. Now, coming from a Jewish perspective, which of course that's why I'm part of your panel discussion today. Growing up and hearing my father's stories about the loss of life that took place in the Holocaust. And he came from a very traditional family, in which there were 4 children and his parents. By our American standards today, they would have been considered poor. They did not consider themselves to be poor. They always had food to eat. They lived in conditions that Americans today would consider to be in poverty. We're a very spoiled people in America today. That's an interesting point also to touch on. They sold police uniforms in a market square in a town called Częstochowa, Poland, and the table that they cut the fabric on to make the uniforms, my father put a mattress on that at night, and he slept on that at night. Got up before dawn to actually physically load a wagon with the goods to go to the market before he went to school. So a very different world. And there were very close-knit people in those days. Family was very important, even pre-war Poland, circumstances were not good for Jews. There was a lot of prejudice and persecution concerning Jews in Poland before the war. But family was very close. And he lost all of his siblings and his parents, and a very long and wide extended family where people loved each other. They were very deeply connected. And only my father and 3 cousins survived this vast extended family. So growing up understanding that, and as I evolved as a person in my own right, I always had a hard time wrapping my head around the concept of abortion. The whole concept that the most precious thing, of course, is a child. And especially amongst the Jewish people, having lost 6 million people, and so many children were murdered. My father was a young, strong man. So when the Nazis made selections, they would make selections. He would be chosen to survive because he could do hard physical labor. Young children were just murdered outright. There's a story about, all kinds of stories about women who did the best they could to hide their babies from the Nazis. Women who were pregnant and gave birth in the concentration camps and had their babies snatched from them and murdered right after birth. Stories about women who tried to hide the fact that they were pregnant because a Nazi soldier would notice she was pregnant and kick her in the stomach to cause her to miscarry. So the idea of going from a situation where life is, precious, and you appreciate family, and the greatest thing is to have a child. There's a custom of bris milah, of the circumcision ceremony for a young Jewish boy when he's born, and there's a celebration for girls when girls are born also. But this is a celebratory thing. Having family, having children is so precious. And for me, it's been it's torturous for me to see how within the Jewish community, um, and this is a bigger picture altogether that we're going to touch on, that the political left, and part of their agenda, of course, is pushing abortion, that they've infected different communities, and I call it an infection. And right now, people are worried about the COVID infection, but the infection of leftism, I think, is a far more virulent and far more dangerous disease than the coronavirus is. Leftism has affected America. It's affected various different communities in America, including the Jewish community, which I'm talking about. It's infected the whole world, and it's a very damaging and dangerous infection. And the idea of going from embracing family, seeing the birth of every child as being a gift from God, celebrating that, and go from that to embracing the concept of abortion, to end the pregnancy arbitrarily, to just snuff out life, is to me is an absolute abomination, and it's a mind-boggling thing. Now, you've read my personal history. I have my own evolution, I call it, in my own life's journey. I've seen a lot of different things in life. I came from a traditional family, but I'm speaking to a bunch of young people today. I'm going to take you in a little time machine. I was a hippie back in the day. I was an anti-war protester. I was one of the younger ones, right? I was the younger one. I was like 14, 15 years old. I was already at the anti-war demonstrations. So I went from the political left in a journey that I'm still on. Okay, but even back in the days when I would have been aligned with the political left, the concept of abortion still bothered me even in those days. Even in those days, it bothered me that I took a perspective in those days in which I said that I didn't want to control what other people did, so I would have been in favor of legal abortion, but I would, in terms of anything that would touch my own family and my own life, I would have been drastically opposed to it, even in my leftist days. Because to me, the concept, especially after, as I mentioned, growing up with my father's stories about losing his family, and he came to this country and he appreciated this country so much. I'll share this with you, something I like repeating. In the days when I was an anti-war protester, my father was a bit horrified that someone would protest. I felt I was doing something positive. But he would tell me, oftentimes when I came back from the protest, he would tell me, I'll imitate his accent, he'd say, "You know what? You should get down on the floor and kiss the ground of this country and thank God every day for being an American," he would tell me. That's what my father said, because he appreciated this country and how great this country is, and the freedom and opportunity this country has given any human being who wants to embrace that opportunity. And he worked and strived to rebuild a family that he lost in the Holocaust. I'm named after his father, and he named my sister after his mother, and other members of the family were named after his other siblings. His idea was recreating life that was destroyed. So a pregnancy in our family was always a source of exaltation, a source of celebration, because now new life was going to come into the world to replace life that had been stolen, life that had been snuffed out. So that's kind of a foundation that I come from, just in a personal sense. But I want to touch on a number of different things. And today is Shabbat, or Shabbos. I like pronouncing it Shabbos. I'm a traditionalist. And it also is the holiday of Sukkot, or Sukkot, as some people like to pronounce it. And Sukkot or Sukkot, I don't know how familiar everybody there is with this holiday. I'm going to do this on the screen here. I want to see who else is I like seeing other faces when I speak, not just my own. And Sukkot is a holiday. You probably know it as a Feast of the Tabernacles. You might know it as that, right? You build this little shack type structure, and for the duration of the holiday, for the 7 days, The idea is to dwell in there. The Bible gives the story, says that the children of Israel, as they were leaving, liberated by God from slavery in Egypt, that they dwelt in these temporary structures. And so the holiday of Sukkot is a remembrance of also that liberation from slavery. But also has a lot of other connotations. It is a harvest holiday also. And there's a lot of deep lessons. So one of those things is that the sukkah, that little structure, is a temporary structure. A temporary structure. And that's to remind us that we are also in this world in a temporary basis. Our soul is eternal. The soul is a spark of God. The soul is eternal. But our physical body is here temporarily. Our physical body is like the sukkah. Like the sukkah. And like the sukkah is a place where you go and you celebrate your awareness of God. You come in with an understanding of being temporary. I relate that in a sense to this issue that we're talking about here. The idea of Sukkot or Sukkot is a harvest holiday. And what's the greatest fruit that a human being could produce is a child. A child, to give birth. Ru Ravu is the first commandment given in the Torah, in the Bible. Adam and Eve are told to be fruitful and multiply. So we create much in the world around us as human beings. But on Sukkot, it reminds us that we're here in the world temporarily. God has taken this eternal soul, and we have the privilege of having this body, which is here temporarily in this world. I got to do this. I'm sorry, I'm back. This is my iPhone, so I get a call comes through, I have to turn the call off. So we're in this world temporarily, and we're here in this world to make the world more beautiful. And as you know, if you're a farmer, you grow produce. That's what you do. If you're in other different industries, professions, you produce. We have the capacity to do good in this world, but also the fruit that we give forth from ourselves, and as a man and a woman unite together, is to give birth to children. That's the greatest thing that we could do as a human being. Now, it's a great privilege to be able to do that. Some people, if you look, remember the stories we all know, familiar with the stories in the Bible, right? Abraham and Sarah are not able to have children right away, right? They have pain over this. It leads to this whole situation where Sarah convinces Abraham to have a child with her handmaiden Hagar. And we know how, the whole story, how that turned out. They ended up going off, being exiled, going off, and Ishmael founds people which we know as the Arabs today, actually, the cousins to the Jewish people. Later on, once again, Yitzchak, right, Isaac, and Rivka, Rebecca, once again, have problems having children. So the concept is having children is something people always wanted to do. The idea of intentionally snuffing out a growing human being inside a woman, a precious baby, is an anathema to Torah, to the Bible, and to Jewish thought. This is something it's a bizarre situation that we live in today, in which people knowingly go and end a growing baby's life inside a mother. It's bizarre. If you even go cross cultures, every culture in the world up until modern times celebrated having children. When a woman became pregnant, some cultures have great celebrations. And when a baby's born, great celebrations. Consider the opposite, a curse. For a woman to become pregnant, that she's going to give birth, this is something that's a new phenomena in our world. Not that there hadn't been abortions for various different reasons throughout time. I was going through some texts recently, and actually there was Philo, who is in antiquity, a Jewish writer in the Greco-Roman world, talked about how in the Greco-Roman world, people already were practicing abortion then. And he was talking about how it was an anathema to Judaism, and Jews stood up strongly against this idea of abortion even then. So there were abortions even in ancient time, but not to the extent that we have today, where it's celebrated and made to be, you see celebrities today who say they wish that they had an abortion. It's one thing, the only thing they regret in life is they did not have an abortion. This is something which is completely bizarre, and I want to talk about some of my own concepts about where I think some of this came from. Now, I said I would take you in a little bit of a time machine, right? And before we go into the time machine, I want to point something out. In the holiday of Sukkot that we're in right now, there's mitzvot. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of you probably heard the word mitzvah before. All right. A lot of rabbis will tell you mitzvah means a good deed. Those are cowardly rabbis. That's why they tell you that, because they're cowards, or they don't know better. Doesn't mean that. It means a commandment. It means God's told you to do something or told you not to do something. And it comes from a word from the word related to the Hebrew word for connection. Because every religion would have a theme with what the religion is about. Judaism is about this thing called these mitzvot, these commandments that God gives us instructions about how to connect with other people. That's called a mitzvah bein adam l'chavero. And there's mitzvah bein adam l'makom, commandments between a human being and God. And so the Torah gives these commandments as connections between human beings and connections with God. Now, one of these commandments is to dwell in the sukkah. I call it the Jewish love shack. I don't know, you're too young to remember the song from the B-52s, the love shack. You might know it, but years ago, that went over really well. I always say, okay, we're going to go into the love shack, right? And everybody would laugh and everything. You know the song, I guess. Your generation has exposure to all kinds of music, all kinds of information. All right, so you go into the love shack, you go into the sukkah. Actually, according to traditional Judaism, I need a little sip here. According to traditional Judaism, a man is obligated to go into the sukkah. A woman is not. A woman is not obligated to go into the sukkah. The man is. Well, is that sexist? Is that bigoted? Is that horrible? The woman's being discriminated against? No, it's not that she's not allowed to. She's allowed to. She's not commanded to. And the reason why is that in traditional Judaism, there's a concept that women, it's called Pateres Mina Mitzvah, she's Mizman Grama, which in Hebrew means she's exempted from any time-regulated commandment. So the sukkah is something you're only in during the certain holiday of Sukkot. You only can be in it at certain times. So she's exempted from that. The reason why is that it's considered the woman in her natural state, that her peak state of being a woman is in childbearing years. That her focus on life is to be giving birth, giving life to the world, giving birth to children, raising children, making a home. Those are those are considered to be such a high and holy, powerful thing to care for a child, that it supersedes the commandment to dwell in the sukkah. That's how holy it is. This is a really powerful concept, because Judaism says that men and women are complementary and create a whole. They create a whole. They come together to create a whole. There's a thing called a medrash. A medrash, they call it a homiletical teaching on the Torah. And they're not to be taken literally necessarily. They're to teach deep concepts. And one of them is that Adam and Eve were it talks about how in one of the creation stories, how Eve was created from Adam's rib. So this medrash says that Adam and Eve were actually one person together, like with two faces and everything, and that God split them apart, right? And that the idea of marriage in the Jewish concept is Adam and Eve coming back together and make that whole again. But to make that whole, there you have to be complementary halves. If they're exactly the same part, they don't fit together. They have to fit together because they're two complementary parts. So in a traditional Jewish outlook, a woman and a man have different roles. Doesn't mean that they can't do certain things the same way. A man, of course, should help take care of the children. A loving father helps nurture and helps raise and helps care for his children. A woman, if she has talents and various different abilities, there's no reason why she can't exercise those talents. She can't be successful with God-given talents that she's been blessed with. But the obligations are different, they're complementary obligations. And a woman's primary purpose in the world is to be a mother, really. Now, so everybody's not doesn't have that blessing. We can't answer all the questions why God makes life difficult for people in different ways. Some women have never been able to give birth, whatever. But we see that even a woman who can't would want to. We see this from all these biblical stories we mentioned. So, how do we get to where we are today, which leads to the abortion issue? Well, this past week, there was a woman named Helen Reddy who passed away. I'm sure she was a nice person. She was a very talented singer, had a lot of hits. Her most notable hit is a song, I Am Woman. Are you familiar with that one? Okay, so I am woman, hear me roar. All that stuff, right? Okay. Unfortunately, for sure she was a wonderful lady. She was a great performer. There was so whoever wrote that song, it was in the times. But that song kind of became a theme song in a sense, for the destruction of the traditional family. Because the words of those songs were that basically women have been oppressed by men and kept from reaching their potential, and they have to break away from that traditional woman's role and challenge men and compete with men and work and be in that man's world. And the world that the women were in before was unsatisfactory. It was holding them back. It was oppressing them. And that song was a reflection of what was going on in the world in those days. Uh, Before it was called publicly feminism, it was called the women's lib movement. Women's lib movement. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. It was called women's lib. And a lot of men supported it because women were burning their bras. And so guys liked that idea. And it was considered that a woman should be sexually liberated. That instead of the old paradigm where the man would, be the old paradigm where the man would kind of be an aggressor and the woman would let him know in a traditional setting that that's not okay unless we're married, right? That would kind of be the message there, that a man, to be able to exercise his sexual urges, would have to be a gentleman about it, and it would involve a committed relationship, and preferably a marital relationship that would lead to family and children. So the natural urges would be harnessed into something beautiful and holy and create family, right? But in those days, the women's lib movement said, no, women should be out there, just do your thing, right? That was the thing. That was the saying, do your thing, right? And so the women were burning their bras and the women were being sexually liberated and all this kind of stuff was going on. And the guys liked it too, right? That's because we have what's called a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Tov in Jewish thinking. These are two inclinations that we have. There's two inclinations. There's different terminologies how to put it. Yetzer Tov would mean a good inclination. Yetzer Hara would mean a negative or bad inclination. Now that's how we see it, because we see the good inclination is also termed in mystical terms as the nefesh elokis, as a godly soul, and this negative inclination is termed to be what they would call a nefesh bahamis, an animal soul. Now, according to Jewish thinking, this is necessary to have these two inclinations because we live in a physical world. We live in a physical world. So therefore, to interact with the physical world, which we are part of, you have the animal urges. But they have to be, and part of the beauty of being a human being is we don't just act on animal urges. We have this godly soul, this is what we call the good inclination, which then directs the animal urges in the proper channels correctly. And so, therefore, in traditional Jewish thinking, it's very similar, I'm sure, in traditional Christian thinking, traditional religious thinking, probably universally, would take these animal urges and put them into certain structures and formats. And we saw this fracture during these days of the women's lib movement, the hippie days and all these days, and even before that, the bohemian days, the beatnik days, there was been an eroding of those traditional values. So basically, instead of the Yetzer Tov, or the godly soul, and there's a Hasidic metaphor that likens it to like a horse and a rider. A horse is a horse, right? Horse does what a horse wants to do, right? And a horse doesn't have the judgment. So a horse will go and do things that maybe will be even dangerous to the horse because the horse has an urge. The horse wants something, right? But if the horse has a rider, an intelligent rider to direct the horse, then the horse becomes very useful and the horse is then directed appropriately. So it's the same way like with the our body, right? Our body is connected in the physical world, this gift, this temporary gift that we have called the body. So the good inclination is supposed to be directing it. What started to take place is in the erosion of traditional values, religious values, is now instead of the godly soul having the reins to the horse, it's the other way around, where the Yetzer Hara, the animal inclination, is now in charge. Now, I don't believe that was by accident. I don't believe that was by accident at all. We see the erosion of these values coming from an effort to overturn our traditional society, not just in terms of traditional value, but actually to destroy what the United States is. This all relates in together. And the abortion issue is a big part of that. In communist countries, abortion's not a big deal, is it? Right? No. It's a matter of fact, if the state decides they want the people to have more children, then they make them have more children. But look at communist China, right? Communist China, the government tells them that you're not allowed to. They'll even do infanticide if they have to, because the state is in charge, right? There's no God in the equation, right? There's no family values in the equation. It's all what the government, the state decides. The state is God right now. Now, there's been an effort to overturn what we call the United States that's been going on since the 1930s. Since the 1930s, communists have been infiltrating themselves into the United States. Everybody talks about McCarthyism as a bad word. You might not think this really touches on the issue of abortion, but Joe McCarthy was right. This guy was right. He understood, and it goes before McCarthy. You go back and you look into the 1930s, there was a Congressman Dies who understood that communists were beginning to infiltrate themselves into various agencies of the government and institutions in our society. And that, but what happened is during World War II, because of the way the politics came out, remember, first Stalin and Hitler were buds, right? They were bros together, to take over the world. And then Hitler stabbed Stalin in the back. So Stalin eventually becomes an American ally, and Roosevelt likes Uncle Joe. He likes Uncle Joe. So all of a sudden, some of the restrictions that were put up about communist infiltration started being removed. They weren't there anymore. And so since the 1930s, and then especially starting World War II, this is not the time and place to go into the exact details on this. This is something that I speak about often. Communists began to infiltrate themselves into our different institutions in society. And one of the ideas that they had is to overturn all of our traditional values in our societies to be able to supplant our constitutional republic that we live in. And our constitutional republic is built on traditional Judeo-Christian values. That's what our whole society is built upon. We look at, you have this Black Lives Matter movement today, right? What is one of the things they want to remove? They talk about destroying the nuclear family. That's one of the things they talk about. They want to destroy the nuclear family. They talk about that children should be raised by a community of mothers and parents. No father in the equation also. So none of these things are accidental. And the pushing of abortion is part of that, because the pushing of abortion is part of the desensitizing people to the value of human life as being a gift from God, of being a unique spark, a unique soul being brought into the world by God, and a privilege and it's a privilege for a specific family. A child coming into the world now does not belong to the state. This child coming into the world is a gift between mom and dad and grandparents and the family. And then on top of that, it's a gift to our society. It's not a gift to the state. But that's why, one of the reasons behind the pushing of abortion and also the eroding of all the other values, traditional values in our society. It's part of abortion in and of itself is an abomination. But the abortion agenda is all part of the overturning of traditional values. You look at today, I'm totally politically incorrect, so if anybody's offended by this, I'm sorry. I mean, I say what I think. This stage of my life, I mean, people get mad at me if they want. It's okay. We look at today, there's this whole big expansion in transgenderism, right? You're in the university world. Now, you probably, those of you who are students, you probably get a thing where you have to pick your pronoun before the class starts or something like that. Do you have to do that I'm sure at Yale you have to do that, right? You have G's and you have to pick up 70. I don't know how many genders are they up to today. I don't know. I lost track. I mean, you can't keep track. They'll come up with new ones all the time, whatever it is. So now, when I was your age, there were always individuals who had this, gender dysmorphia. This used to be considered a psychiatric condition, but it wasn't like it is today, because it's promoted in today's world, and it all goes back to what I touched on earlier. It all goes back to this effort, this feminist movement, which was meant to not just disrupt the family structure, but also disrupt the traditional roles of men and the identification of men and women. Now, going back to, where I was talking about the differences between men and women in terms of religious obligation, traditionally, it was always taught that a little boy was supposed to spend, this is something in our modern world which was disruptive, is in earlier times, men did not work that far from the home. So therefore everybody was closer together. A little boy would be with his mother until he was like 5 or 6 years old, and then he's supposed to be with dad. And that's maybe when he's not in school, but he would be with his dad. So he'd be role modeling from his dad how to learn to be a man. Meanwhile, his sisters are with mom learning how to be a woman, right? And what do you learn? And when I was, I don't know if they even still sell them. When I was a they still sell baby dolls. They even allow that to be sold anymore. My sisters all had little baby dolls with little baby carriages, and they all played being mommy. And so if you're raising a little girl that she wants to play being mommy, that means that having a baby is precious, right? She's looking forward to being a mommy, looking forward to having babies, right? She's modeling this as a little girl. She's modeling this with her mom. Today, not so much, right? From what I understand, I don't keep track so much of what they're selling for kids' toys anymore. My son has grown up, so I don't buy kids' toys anymore. But from what I understand, they sell little dolls that look like prostitutes for little girls to play with, and they have dolls now that are non-gendered dolls that you could change the genders back and forth on the dolls. So this is the really kind of perverse modeling that's going on in society today. And once again, this is all intentional, but it was incremental. Now, I haven't touched that much on, I haven't even been keeping track of time, so I don't know how much time I have left. I'm just talking. But I haven't talked so much on the issues of Jewish law and abortion. I don't know how much you want me to speak about that. I figured that a lot of times when a Jewish representative is asked to speak on this, that's what it's usually a rabbi. That's what the rabbi is going to speak about. Which text says that you're allowed, and this, that, and the other. Yeah, and that's a little dry. And I want to get to the root of why we're into the problem today. But just touching on the Jewish law aspect, we see a lot of dishonesty today. We see a lot of liberal so-called rabbis who will tell you Judaism approves of abortion, right? You'll have all these Jewish organizations that have been infiltrated saying Judaism is pro-choice. Now, that's a nice euphemism for killing babies, right? Pro-choice, right? So, if you're choosing to kill a developing baby inside the mom, okay, what is your next choice? You're going to go kill grandpa too. He's getting too old, right? That's a choice, right? That's a choice. You chose to do it, right? It's don't want to have to take care of him. He's too old. He's a nuisance right now. So, just simply speaking, Judaism is forbidden by traditional Judaism. Now, speaking about myself, I don't represent any particular movement in Judaism. I'm educated as an Orthodox rabbi. I'm former dox, I call myself, because I've been serving in non-Orthodox congregations throughout my career, and I adapted to the world that I live in. So I would no longer be deemed be Orthodox according to Orthodox standards. My views of right and wrong, though, are still very much rooted in my Orthodox education. And Judaism does not permit abortion, except in certain very, very limited circumstances. Just to touch on that on questions and answers, I can go maybe more detail. But you'll see a lot of liberal rabbis will pervert texts to make it appear as though abortions are allowed. We see that, we see there's in the book of Leviticus, right? It says, "B'chaya b'hen." You should live by these laws. Life is the most important thing. And there's many rabbinical commentaries that talk about that "B'chaya b'hen" means that one can violate almost any prohibition in the Torah to save life. And these commentaries also talk about this even applies to the case where you have a pregnant woman. Somebody had come about a case of rape. I see that popped up on the screen. I'll talk about that in just a moment. You see that a woman who would be, let's say, who's pregnant, and she has some kind of a circumstance where she feels that her pregnancy is threatened. According to these commentaries, even in that situation where a potential baby has not been born yet, the woman would be able to violate the Sabbath to make sure that her pregnancy went through successfully. Now, Judaism is not monolithic. We don't have a pope in Judaism. In the Orthodox world, there are a number of great rabbis who different people look to for what's called halachic decisions, Jewish law decisions. So there's hard to say a definitive anything, but the vast majority of opinions and the predominant opinions are really what we're going to be talking about here. And today, these liberal rabbis have totally distorted texts to try to make it appear that abortion is permitted. For instance, they take a text in the book of Exodus that talks about two men who are fighting and they collide with a pregnant woman and she miscarries, and their penalty is a financial penalty that they have to pay. So they try to extrapolate from that there's a permission to perform abortions. That's a corruption of the text. First of all, that's an accidental mishap that took place. That's has nothing to do with this at all. It's a complete distortion of the text. According to Judaism, someone came up on the screen about rape or incest. According to strictly the opinions of most what's called the poskim, the great rabbis who who study these things in depth and have come up with definitive opinions, that even in the case of rape or incest, there's no permission to perform an abortion. It's not that baby's fault how that baby came into the world. We don't understand oftentimes why we're put in the positions we're put into in God's world. We're all given different tests. The rabbis teach that we're never given a test that we can't pass. Some of our tests are very painful. And these are questions that we can't really answer in this forum or any other, really. But in Jewish history, unfortunately, there were many cases of babies who were born due to rape. Jews were subject to persecution in many different societies. And you heard the word pogrom, probably. Pogrom was an organized persecution of Jewish communities, usually in Central and Eastern Europe. Sometimes when these communities were being ravaged, not only were people being beaten or sometimes murdered or having their businesses burnt down or homes burnt down, but women were often raped. Occasionally, a woman would become pregnant that way. Now, that's not the best circumstance to bring a baby into the world, but that baby was still brought through the full term by that baby's mother, and that child was loved by that baby's mother, right? So there's no permission for an abortion for those reasons. The predominant opinion in Jewish thought is The only permission for an abortion would be where the baby would be, the developing baby would be called what's called a rodef. Now, let me back up a little bit because there's some opinions they find. The Talmud goes through a lot of discussions, and Talmud is not just a book. It's actually a compendium of discussions that go over hundreds of years. It's kind of like you had a court stenographer taking notes as rabbis were having discussions back and forth over hundreds of years. So it's very difficult to learn and very difficult to derive, decisions from it. Then following, the Talmud, there's commentaries on the Talmud. There's many, many volumes of the Talmud. There's commentaries on them. And then from the commentaries come many, many books of Jewish law, a lot of arguments about how to understand it properly. This is very complex stuff, right? And it really can make your head spin, right? But so there was discussions in the Talmud about when a baby's actually really formed, whether it's up to 40 days, it's not really considered a baby yet. Even if that was true, that when a baby's heartbeat first emerges is about that period of time. And also, the discussions in the Talmud don't have our up-to-date medical technology and science that we have today. With the science and technology we have today, there's virtually no case where, first of all, I was going to say is that the only case where abortion would be clearly allowed is where it would be complete endangerment to the mother's life to give birth. Now, Judaism will differ from, let's say, Catholicism. Catholicism, from what I understand, I'm not a Catholic priest, but this is what I know. He'll tell me if I'm wrong, that if there's a choice between the baby's life or the mother's life, a much horrible situation no one would ever want to imagine, right? And having to make a choice like that. But the baby's life would take precedence over the mother's life because the baby has not experienced sin yet. I don't know if that's right. That's what I've learned. I'm not an expert in Catholicism. That's my understanding. You'll correct me if that's wrong. In Judaism, the mother's life would take precedence because she is what's called a vadai. She's already living, and the baby is emerging, and also the baby is what's become what's called in halakha terms a rodef. A rodef is someone who is literally chasing after someone to kill somebody. So even if it's not intentional, right? Not intentional, the baby's life is threatening the mother's life. So that's why the mother's life would come first, because the baby's the threat to the mother's existence. Now, with today's technology that we have, the medical technology, I don't even know if that case exists anymore. There's a case. I'm not a doctor, but from what I understand, with today's medical technology, that case may not even exist anymore. If that case does not exist, there is no permission for abortion. You'll also find some rabbis who have writings which they'll say that, wouldn't you say most women would? I can't. It doesn't come up. The whole text message part doesn't come
Rabbi,
up.
we'll pose them as questions when you're done with your remarks. Don't worry.
Okay. All right. So we'll get to that. So in any case, there is basically, as a matter of fact, there's discussion in Jewish law about people who do they create pre-embryos for artificial insemination and all that, for medically assisted pregnancies. Whether you could even destroy the pre-embryos that are created. There's a lot of discussion in many opinions, but the majority opinion would say you can't even. This is how strict traditional Judaism comes when it comes to the issue of abortion. So the issue of abortion, once again, I'm getting to some of the details here, but I really wanted to touch on what I spoke about earlier, that the idea is that I wanted to get across here today is that abortion is a symptom of a greater malady which faces society today. And those of you who are part of the pro-life movement, what you're doing is very, very important. You are treating a specific injury that's taken place in our society from a far more widespread disease, the disease of the infiltration into our society of, and I'll just use it what it comes from communism, from the forces. Some people might not even identify themselves as communists, but the anti-traditional, anti-democracy, anti-capitalism, anti-America forces that we see in our society today, that the abortion plague that we have in our society is one of many symptoms of that invasion into our society. And all these things are connected today. The fact that we have all these people trying to restrict our freedom of speech, tell us what we can say and what we can't say, people trying to impose this new political correctness on us, all these different maladies that we see in our society today, and abortion, the plague of abortion being one of the most horrible symptoms, are all part of the same disease. An effort by an infiltration into our society to overturn what has been the greatest society on this planet ever in history. My own personal theological perspective is that God has kind of a two-course thing. That you look into the Bible, God chose the Jewish people to bring the idea of monotheism into the world, and Christianity stemmed off of Judaism. And my own theological belief as part of God's plan was for Christianity to then be able to spread to the rest of the world the idea of the one God, the God of Israel. And so in the state of Israel itself is a fulfillment of God's promises. They have this center of God consciousness, which is really what the state of Israel should become. But then the other part of God's plan is a more universal plan, is the United States is meant to be a beacon to the world. A beacon to the world of what it means to be a society that's based upon the idea of uniqueness and the value of the individual, filled with that is in this world because God has put that individual in this world, and God has imbued that individual with rights just because that person is a creation of God, and that person is then supposed to fulfill the human destiny of bringing God's light into the world, and doing this through the process of, once again, exalting the value of the individual and living in a society in which we all have these human rights. Follow what our country was founded upon: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is like you have two hands. Like our hands, God doesn't have physical hands, right? But it's a metaphor. It's like God's two hands in the world. And so I believe that's why the forces of the left focus primarily on the destruction of the United States and the destruction of the state of Israel, because those are the two godly representations of organized society in our world today. And the abortion is part of that destruction of these gifts from God. Now, I have to point out that that's one of the problems in Israel. Israel has a big problem with abortion because there's a lot of secularists in Israel who also are so-called pro-choice. It's a big problem there also. So it's a big problem everywhere. I don't know how long I've spoken. Have I gone long enough?
Yes, sir. If you'd like to take some questions, we have some questions in the chat for you, but we'll also
Oh,
kind of be abutting our little break before the panel soon.
all right, so let's take some questions. I can, one thing about rabbis is we could talk. So just wind me up and let me go. That's what we say. It's winding up. See, I'm from another era. You're winding it up, right? So it's kind of like that. I don't think anything winds up anymore. So okay, well, so if you want to give me some questions, if this is the time, I can't read everything. Let's see, is the fight to restore our popular culture?
Yeah, I can post some questions for you, so you don't have to read. You can just
Okay.
I can pick out a few and then save some of them for the panel that everyone can answer. But yeah, we can actually start with the most recent one. Is the fight to restore popular culture lost, or are there strategies for us to turn back the tide? And then I would also like to say, what within the Jewish community do dialogues on abortion look like right now? What kind of theological mechanisms are there to talk about these things with other people who are Jewish?
All right, those are two good questions. I'm an optimist, right? If you believe in God, you got to be an optimist, right? Because God's really in charge of this world. We have free choice. We're human beings. We can make ourselves a vessel for God's energy, for God's blessings, for God's light. That's what we do, right? So if we lose hope, then we plug up those channels. Then it's like pulling down the window shades. The light doesn't come through anymore, right? So I'm always going to be an optimist. And so I don't think that hope is all lost. I couldn't believe that. If I believed that, I would turn into an atheist. And I know that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen. So I haven't lost hope. I think that a lot of us have been very complacent. Those of us who have traditional values have been complacent. And because people with traditional values are good people, we're loving people, and we respect other people. So we've given a lot of room for the evil forces to kind of move in. right? And whatever label you want to put on those forces, in Kabbalistic terms, they call it the Sitra Achra, the other side, or you can even call it Brother Satan, whatever you want to call it, right? But we kind of let that come in because we're nice people, right? So right now it's time for us to kind of recognize what's going on. And so but I haven't lost hope at all. We see what's very negative stuff going on. Now, in terms of the Jewish community, unfortunately, the majority of the Jewish community is liberal and identifies with the Democrat Party. And this is not the forum to discuss the reasons for that. There's a lot of different reasons for that. The simplest one I would give you is most Jews today are middle class, or upper middle class, and they subscribe to the same values as everybody else in their social group subscribes to. So it's not a uniquely Jewish problem, but it is an issue, the pro-life issue, being pro-life, when many people believe. I've talked to members of the Jewish community who actually admit that they've replaced the Torah with the New York Times. They'll actually admit to that. They'll say, yeah, that's my Torah is the New York Times. It's tragic. But once again, pointing fingers and attributing blame doesn't solve anything. It could be that those who, from the traditional world, have not been good at passing on these values and being good educators, but or the infiltration of the left into all the institutions of our society. The left infiltrates itself into synagogues and churches. Remember, they control the public school system. They control the media. I mean, so it's just another example of this phenomenon. So, but I'm open about my opinions. I have a non-Orthodox congregation, and I would say a lot of them consider being pro-choice to be just the de jure thing you're supposed to be, right? That's what all nice people are, pro-choice. It's a woman's body, her choice. Don't you want to know that? And I try to explain otherwise to them, and you just have to be careful with the language that you choose. You don't want to be, it doesn't do any good to throw slogans at each other. That doesn't get you anywhere. So there's a term in Hebrew called derech agav, which really means like going around through the back door, right? So I usually throw out ideas to them when I want to change people's minds on this issue. So, for instance, when I speak in a pro-life sense, I'll relate it into a Torah portion. I'll talk about how some of the ladies in the congregation were so excited because they now have grandchildren. Like, grandchildren are a rarity sometimes, right? So they have grandchildren, and how they're showing each other the pictures on the cell phone and all that. And I'll start talking about that. They'll get all excited talking about their grandchildren. I'll say, if you were so excited while your daughter was pregnant, and they're so excited to have that grandchild, could you imagine uprooting that child from your daughter while the child was developing, killing that child? The child that's so precious to you that you waited so long for, the grandchild. So I try to relate it into them personally, like that, the concept, because talking over people's heads or throwing slogans at somebody doesn't fix anything.
Thank you, Rabbi. The next question is, what does the Jewish tradition have to say about contraception and family planning for the sake of the well-being of a woman?
All right. Well, okay. Now, I'll give you, from the Orthodox perspective, they only allow contraception if you get what's called a heter. It means a permission from a top rabbi, from a big, great Torah scholar rabbi. I will dissent a little bit from that, the Orthodox opinion, in my own right, because I don't call myself Orthodox anymore. They believe there's a biblical prohibition on wasting seed, number one. And they believe having a child, once again, puravu, is a biblical commandment, and that you don't get in the way of fulfilling that commandment. So in the Orthodox world, the bottom line is that you don't use contraception unless there are circumstances. Like, let's say a woman has a certain health situation and she can't have a child too quickly after this child. She needs more recovery time. There can be a number of different reasons. And then the rabbi will give her what's called a heter. She'll be allowed to use certain forms of contraception are considered to be more acceptable than others, and they'll allow that. My own personal opinion is I'm not against contraception. I believe I I have an academic side to myself also, where I'm not a pure traditionalist. In medieval times, they believed that a child was created from homunculus, that within the semen was a little tiny human being that grew inside the mother. I suspect that some of the medieval halachic opinions against contraception come from that period of time. So I myself am not opposed to contraception. If someone would ask me the question, I would tell them to use their own conscience, basically. But I would rather have someone use contraception than come into the situation where they're going to be contemplating abortion. I would consider that I don't even want to say the lesser of two evils. I don't think it comes to even that extent. But that's my own personal opinion. But within the Orthodox world, they have big families, and so they don't use contraception except for in certain circumstances where they get permission from a rabbi who's considered a great scholar, it's a very heavy decision. He has to really look into the details. It's not a one size fits all. It depends on the individual.
Thank you, Rabbi. We'll ask one more question before we take a brief break so people can stretch their legs, use the restroom, get a cup of tea before the panel. The rest of the questions that we've been sent for you, we'll use at the panel. So this
Okay.
question comes from the chat again. It says, I believe that the memory of the Holocaust may be part of the reason that so many Jews support abortion. They believe that if they do not reach a certain level of financial and professional success, that they would be too vulnerable to anti-Semitism. An unplanned pregnancy may actually threaten lives by keeping someone at a lower professional and economic level and thus making women vulnerable to anti-Semitism. For example, becoming a doctor or a millionaire will mean that if there's anti Semitism, one can always get a visa to another country. Can you comment on that kind of argument?
Well, I don't think that's true. I think it could be that there are individuals who maybe thought that way. My own experience is as the son of a Holocaust survivor who was raised initially in what I would call a conservadox family, a family that was kind of between conservative movement and Orthodox. We don't have time to talk about the different movements of Judaism, but and raised around other families with similar kind of stories. I don't remember anybody ever thinking like that whatsoever. I think that there's just Judaism. Um, Education has always been very important within Judaism, and the United States gave Jews an opportunity to succeed that they didn't have it other places. And so people seized upon that. And there was always this idea, which I think most people share, of wanting your children to have a better life than you have. So the idea is earlier generations scrimped and saved so their kids could get an education and so on and so forth. And part of that process of becoming more educated, they ended up entering a different strata of society with different values. Once again, I believe that most Jews who hold liberal opinions, it's not. I don't know if it's so unique to just being Jewish. I think that if you talk to people from any other background who live in the same areas and share the same socioeconomic status and belong to the same, read the same newspapers and belong to the same type of organizations, they share the same opinions. So what happened is, I think that Jews ended up success was very good for the Jewish people in terms of everybody wants to live better than a previous generation, but with that success came a little bit of poison also. As they entered different realms of society, they just adopted the worldview and opinions of those areas of society. I don't think that I don't could be are people who think that way, but I never met anybody who believed that abortion was a good response to the Holocaust. All the families that I grew up around were kind of like my father's perspective was, as he was rebuilding what was destroyed. And I never met anybody, at least in the circles that I grew up around, that thought differently.